Okay, this week is our last week, and we're talking about nonfiction narratives. So first of all, it's useful to talk about nonfiction and what we mean by that. So all of the narratives that we've been engaging with so far are fictional narratives, meaning that they are imagined, they're made up in some way, they're created, that they don't have while they might reflect reality, they're not telling the sort of real stories of things that have happened, even though they might, authors might be using some of their real experiences to create the fictional works. So nonfiction are, and particularly narratives that are nonfiction, are stories that are based in reality, they're real stories rather than fictional ones. So one thing that's important to note about nonfiction is that it is based on real facts and information that's represented as real and truthful things that happened. However, as your Lenses text suggests, and as this is something that's actually very important when we think about nonfiction, these are narratives that are shaped by the teller's perspective. They're shaped by the writer. The way that we interpret narratives is based on our own perspective. So likewise, when we're reading, that's based on our own perspective. Likewise, when someone is interpreting a story, they're writing that story, they're presenting it in a certain way, that is their version of the truth. So in order for something to be nonfiction, we need to sort of understand that there is an effort to tell the truth, to represent something as it happened in reality. But there are ways that versions of the truth could be presented from different writers or different perspectives that would still be non-fictional texts. So there's an issue. Sometimes we've seen things like things that are sort of touted as truth, like the memoir, A Million Little Pieces, I believe it was called, where that was not exactly truthful. It came out to be not exactly truthful. Parts were fabricated. There's a degree to which we could say, okay, this is someone's version of the truth. When things are completely fabricated, that's when it starts to become something that's fictional rather than nonfiction. But with nonfiction, we're looking for texts that are trying to represent what actually happened. So based on facts, based on reality, things that have happened. So that is, you might see that is a fuzzy line, and that causes some issues sometimes when we think about nonfictional texts, but that is the goal of nonfiction. And we have to understand, in order for something to be nonfiction, there needs to be the goal that the writer has to tell the truth as much as they can do so. There are a lot of theories about nonfiction, and we won't get into those extensively. Just suffice to say that it's something that is supposed to be based on reality and real facts, and that is the goal, that it's represented as such, and it is close to the truth as possible for that writer. So creative nonfiction is a form of nonfiction where authors are using techniques of fiction writers to represent factual occurrences. So they're telling the story in a way that's engaging, that looks very similar and sometimes to fictional narratives, because it's using things like figurative language and particular points of view and dialogue to tell these stories. But there are many different types of nonfiction texts. So think back to the beginning of the term when we were reading different definitions of narrative from journalists. Journalism is a form of nonfiction narrative telling. So that's something that we can say is also a form of telling narratives, is telling the story of what has happened in the news, the events that have happened in the news. So mostly with literature courses, we focus on creative nonfiction, so things that are sort of geared towards being more in the style or the sort of written form of fiction texts, despite there being nonfiction. But that's not to say that there are not other forms of nonfiction narratives, like journalism. And these are things that we should pay attention to, the ways that these stories are told on a regular basis as we're reading something We may not think of it as interpreting for reading a newspaper, but those are stories that are being told, and it can be helpful for us to analyze them and to think about the perspectives and the ways that they're being structured. So for this week, we're focusing on creative nonfiction, so texts that are sort of geared to be more literary rather than strictly informative. So there are many types of nonfiction, and particularly we're thinking about these sort of forms here as forms of creative nonfiction. So autobiographies, it's where someone is writing the story of their own life. Biography is the story of someone's life that's being written by someone other than the person that they're writing about. So they have an author who's writing the story of someone else. Memoirs are first-person narratives, and they're chronicling more specific events in someone's life as a whole. So the difference between autobiography and memoir is important because it can seem like it's not a very distinct line, but typically autobiographies are covering the sort of entirety of a person's life. Sometimes those are broken up into volumes, so like Ernest Hemingway's biography is broken up into volumes. There are other people's autobiographies that are broken up into volumes. But these two are sort of focusing on the entire scope of someone's life, whereas memoir is told by that first person. So the person that is writing is the person to whom these events are happening or who's part of the events that they're discussing. And the memoir is focusing on more specific events, chronicling a particular period or a particular sort of time. So it's sort of like a chunk of an autobiography, but typically memoirs also focus on not just this person's perspective, but also the sort of larger context or circumstances of what's happening. So memoir, first-person narrative, chronicling more specific events in someone's life as a whole, and often focused on personalities, actions outside just the author. So things that are happening, other perspectives, other sort of characters surrounding, trying to give a picture of that, and focusing on a more particular time or more particular event. That would be memoir rather than autobiography. So we don't have volumes and volumes of memoirs. We have volumes for autobiographies, volumes for biographies. Memoirs stand alone. And then finally we have the nonfiction novel. So this is where actual events, real people are presented in a novel-length narrative using literary devices. So novels that are telling the stories of real events, things that are happening, and trying to represent that in a truthful way, so sticking to the reality. But because they're longer narratives, they end up being a sort of novel length, and the author is using literary devices to sort of engage us like a fictional novel would. So these are sort of big four types of nonfiction, and these are typically longer. We also have short nonfiction, as you read about. So the essay is a sort of typical short nonfiction form that we focus on in literature classes. And the essay itself is a versatile nonfiction form. So you've probably written in other classes, and you know, for this class, the interpretation essay, we recognize this often, the term essay as being in sort of academic sense, but there are a lot more forms for essays, and the nonfiction essays that we're looking at this week are sort of more literary in nature, and they're more informal, so they're not argumentative. There's not an argumentative purpose there. So we think about essays like we might write in a writing class versus essays that we're reading this week as sort of telling stories, telling these sort of, having these particular narratives that they're focusing on. We might think of them as formal essays and informal essays. So formal essays are characterized by logical organization, a seriousness of purpose. They're often trying to persuade of some perspective or some argument. Informal essays are often characterized by humor, self-revelation, so sort of telling some sort of revelation that someone has, the author has, and they're non-argumentative, so they're sort of capturing things that have happened, events that have happened, but not with a particular purpose or argument in mind. So if it helps to sort of think about the difference between essays that you write in academic writing classes, like English 101, for example, these would be formal essays. Those are driven by organization, seriousness of purpose, and argument. Informal essays are the ones that we're reading this week. So non-argumentative focus, focusing on humor, self-revelation, and in the case of Joan Didion, sort of focusing on societal perspective and sort of chronicling what's happening in the Haight-Ashbury district, so this particular period that she's focusing on. In a sense, we might even say that because of the sort of seriousness of purpose, actually, that Joan Didion has, and perhaps it could be sort of between a formal and informal, so sort of hybrid essay. But because it's not sort of touting a particular argument or trying to persuade us of something, typically it would be characterized as more of an informal essay. So then there are other sort of forms that we would look at, forms of the essay. So the personal essay, like the ones we're reading with David Sedaris, essay communicating the essayist's personal experience, the things that have happened to them, with a particular short perspective sort of focus. Lyric essay, a form of personal essay that combines elements of the personal essay with aspects of poetry. So your book talked about how this is often in an experimental form, so they're combining poetic elements, but also the sort of essay form. It's often sort of disjointed, or there's not a lot of organization to it. And the collage essays are those particular types that are more disjointed, where it's sort of putting things together like a collage, like a visual collage. So you have different sort of stylistic forms in this essay form. So combining things like poetry and prose together, often without any sort of specific structure. That's a sort of form of the lyric essay. And then the satirical essay is an essay that's sort of tackling human vice or political critique often. So essays often employing exaggeration, ridicule, and irony to undermine and attack human vices and political folly. So the example that your book gave of A Modest Proposal is a great example of a satirical essay, because it's using a lot of exaggeration and really sort of making fun of and poking fun at the sort of situation, which is actually a dire situation in Ireland of famine, but also bringing to light these sort of larger issues of a lack of care for the Irish citizens by suggesting that they, eat their babies, which is a horrific thing. But he's presenting it in a way that seems serious, and that's thus the sort of satirical quality of it, is that he wouldn't actually suggest this is totally immoral, but it's being presented as a sort of way to solve the problems and to point thus to the larger issues that are at hand in society. So satire is something that we see in different formats. So satire is something that when Stephen Colbert was on in The Daily Show or on the sort of forms of critique that they were doing are satire. But a satirical essay is sort of taking that purpose and composing it in an essay form. So the two authors that we had for this week, David Sedaris and Joan Didion. So David Sedaris is actually someone from North Carolina. So he was born in New York, but he spent most of his childhood and lived most of his adolescence in Raleigh. So he's sort of claimed as a North Carolinian in some ways, and he has some ties to North Carolina. So he's still living. He was born in 1956, and he's an American writer, but he primarily writes comedic essays. That's sort of his form. He has some, we could also say that the essays are sort of have ties to memoir, because they're focused on things that have happened to him in sort of particular instances. But a lot of the things that he writes are also sort of these essay forms. He's also been on the radio and contributed quite a bit to This American Life and NPR, reading his work. His sister is actress Amy Sedaris, who you might recognize as she's a comedic actress as well. And the sort of context for the text that you're reading this week, they all come from this book, Me Talk Pretty One Day, which was published in 2000. He wrote much of it actually in France. And it chronicles this sort of period where Sedaris moved with his partner Hugh to France. So they lived in Normandy and then in Paris. And he has these sort of particular ideas that he's exploring in his essays, and also this sort of period of his life that he's chronicling. So that's where this sort of comedic essay meets the memoir. So I wanted to look at a particular passage from one of the texts that you're actually listening to. There's a link to this on Canvas. So that's the essay is Picapockettoni. The chapter of the text is Picapockettoni. So I want to read this and then talk about it, because one of the things that your book talked about is the ways that we can conduct sort of close readings or examinations of nonfiction and how that differs and also has similarities to the ways that we read fiction. So this is in particular for those creative nonfiction types of writing, so of which this is an example. So let's read this and then we'll talk about it. It's a common mistake for vacationing Americans to assume that everyone around them is French and therefore speaks no English whatsoever. These two didn't seem like exceptionally mean people. Back home, they probably would have had the decency to whisper, but here they felt free to say whatever they wanted, face to face, in a normal tone of voice. It was the same way someone might talk in front of a building or a painting they found particularly unpleasant. An experienced traveler could have told by looking at my shoes that I wasn't French. And even if I were French, it's not as if English is some mysterious tribal dialect spoken only by anthropologists and a small population of cannibals. They happen to teach English in schools all over the world. There are no eligibility requirements. Anyone can learn it. Even people who reportedly smell bad despite the fact that they've just taken a bath and are wearing clean clothes. Because they had used the tiresome word froggy and complained about my odor, I was now licensed to hate this couple as much as I wanted. This made me happy, as I'd wanted to hate them from the moment I'd entered the subway car and seen them hugging the pole. So with this portion of the text, we can see the sort of dry humor that Sedaris is known for. So there's a sort of tone here of sort of sarcastic commentary on the things that he's seeing. So we have a lot of his descriptions that sort of point to that sarcasm, right? So he says, English is it's not as if English is some mysterious tribal dialect spoken only by anthropologists and a small population of cannibals. So that sort of sarcastic approach to the way that he's critiquing their thought process, that they wouldn't be understood in France, that they could speak English and say whatever they wanted without being understood or causing offense. So he's sort of poking fun of that, and also expressing his displeasure with that. He's also sort of commenting on and characterizing these people. So he gives them some credit here, right, that they don't seem to be exceptionally mean people. But he also, it's sort of backhanded, because he says at least back home they would have the decency to whisper, right? So they might still say things that were sort of cruel or critical or unnecessarily rude, but at least, in the U.S. they would have the decency to whisper. So it's sort of a backhanded description of them. He seems to give them credit, but then sort of turn around and say they probably still would, or sort of implying here, they probably still would say mean things, but they would whisper it, right? They wouldn't say it in front of someone's face. So one of the things we might notice stylistically is that there are several sort of short sentences, and that sort of helps to contribute to our understanding of Sedaris' frustration, his critique of the couple, right? This sort of pointing out how ridiculous they are and sort of implying that they're careless and perhaps not very intelligent. And that's sort of represented by the way that he has these sort of staccato sentences, right? When he's talking about how English is something that's taught all over the world. They happen to teach English in schools all over the world. There are no eligibility requirements. anyone can learn it. So these sort of short staccato sentences emphasize how ridiculous it is that this couple is sort of talking out loud in English, expecting no one to understand them. And that's part of his critique here. So we're getting the sort of inner feelings that Sedaris has. So the feelings of frustration, feelings of anger. So the context for this, right, is this couple has sort of felt like he was, or critiquing him on the basis that they felt like he was French, or they thought he was French, and implying, particularly Martin, that he smells bad, right, that he's sort of part of this stereotypical version of a French populace that smells bad. And David Sedaris is, of course, affronted and offended because he sort of points out here that he's taken a bath, he's wearing clean clothes, and they don't have any license to comment on him as such. But he's also a sort of underlying frustration. There's an underlying frustration here with his recognition that they are American, just as he is American, and that though they are thinking that he is French, in some way he sees this sort of frustrating tie that he has, and that he is also American, right? He says that if they'd known, that they could have looked at his shoes and told that he wasn't French. So he's frustrated by this connection that he has to these people because he is also American, but he doesn't want to connect with them. He doesn't want to have similarities with them or sort of have any sort of commonality with them because he finds them to be particularly unpleasant, right? To be very obnoxious, and he's frustrated with the way that he's sort of tied to them through this nationality. And he is sort of delighted that they called him Froggy in a sense because he says he's now licensed to hate them as much as he wants, and he wanted to do that as soon as he saw them as soon as he entered the subway car and saw them hugging the pole. As soon as he essentially, right, saw them transgressing this sort of cultural norm and outing themselves as Americans who are either ignorant of the sort of cultural norms on the subway, ignorant of the culture, or who just don't have enough decency to care about those norms, that would prefer to sort of selfishly hold on to the pole, even though there's a cultural norm of everyone making space so that everyone can hang on to the pole and support themselves. So this is a passage that sort of emphasizes this tone that David Sedaris takes throughout these essays as he's sort of navigating his own cultural identity as an American in France, somebody who is recognized as American, but someone who sees a lot of differences between himself and other Americans and seems to wish to distance himself from his own sort of nation of birth and also the people that he sees coming through and being representative of other Americans. So that's one way that we can sort of look at this passage, and I'd encourage you to think about the ways that the tone that he takes, the details he represents, the way that he represents those details, how that helps us to read this creative nonfiction narrative, and how it helps us to understand the ways that Sedaris is sort of representing his experience. The second author that you have for this week is Joan Didion. So she was born in 1934 and she's still living. So she is an American journalist. She wrote a lot for magazines, in particular Vogue. But she's also a writer of fiction. So she has done a lot of nonfiction, and that's sort of her primary focus, her primary genre. But she also has written fiction. So one of her books, her fictional books, is Play It As It Lays, which is one of her more famous fictional novels. She's also written a number of nonfiction novels as well. So her writing career sort of started in journalism, but like I said, she's done a lot of fiction writing. So she's written nonfiction novels and fictional novels, but also nonfictional essays, magazine articles, and also memoirs. And some of her renown is based on her memoirs. So she's had some really tragic things happen to her Her husband and her daughter both passed away within a very short period of time, and she's dealt with their deaths, the sort of sudden circumstances of their deaths and also tragic circumstances of their deaths in her memoirs. So her work is often described as creative nonfiction, and the things that she's documented in her creative nonfiction include sort of life in California, different perspectives of her own life, and also the things that she's sort of covered as a journalist, like Slouching Towards Bethlehem is sort of documentation of life in a particular time in California in the Haight-Ashbury district. American Vices, and some of the sort of famous instances of American greed, American evil, so she's dealt with and written about so some of the circumstances of the Marilyn Manson murders and trials, for example, but also her own personal struggles with death and her anxiety. This is something that she's been pretty open about, is her own anxiety and her own struggles with that anxiety, and also things like obsessive compulsive disorder. So she's a very talented writer, but she's also a writer who's written about a sort of plethora of topics, including those that are very personal to her. So just like with David Sedaris, I'd like to take some time to look at a passage from Slouching Toward Bethlehem. So this is her sort of chronicling of her journalistic examination of the Haight-Ashbury district in the 70s and the ways that, or 60s and 70s, I believe. And the things that were happening there. So the sort of drug scene, the sort of conspiracy theory scene, the free love scene. These are the things that she is exploring. So let's go ahead and read this and we'll talk about it. One reason I particularly like the warehouse is that a child named Michael is staying there now. Michael's mother, Sue Ann, is a sweet Wayne girl who is always in the kitchen cooking seaweed or baking macrobiotic bread, while Michael amuses himself with joss sticks or an old tambourine or a rocking horse with the paint worn off. The first time I ever saw Michael was on that rocking horse, a very blonde and pale and dirty child on a rocking horse with no paint. A blue theatrical spotlight was the only light in the house that afternoon, and there was Michael in it, crooning to the wooden horse. Michael is 3 years old. He is a bright child, but does not yet talk. This particular night, Michael is trying to light his joss sticks, and there are the usual number of people floating through, and they all drift into Dawn's room and sit on the bed and pass joints. Sharon is very excited when she arrives. "Dawn," she cries breathless, "we got some STP today." At this time, STP is a pretty big deal, remember? Nobody yet knew what it was, and it was relatively, although just relatively, hard to come by. Sharon is blonde and scrubbed and probably 17, but Max is a little vague about that since his court case comes up in a month or so, and he doesn't need statutory rape on top of it. Sharon's parents were living apart when last she saw them. She does not miss school or anything much about her past except her younger brother. "I want to turn him on," she confided one day. "He's 14 now. That's the perfect age. I know where he goes to high school, and someday I'll just go get him." So this passage is a good example of Didion's attention to detail, the way that she is sort of chronicling in a journalistic way the details of the scenes that she witnesses and how they reflect this sort of chaotic scene of drugs and alcohol and free love and so forth. So this scene is particularly interesting, or this passage is particularly interesting because we have this sort of juxtaposition of Michael, this young child, and these adults using drugs, and also this sort of character that's in this sort of liminal space, Sharon, who's not the same age as Michael, so she's not a young child, but she's not an adult either. And this is something that Didion uses to sort of show us how there's a lot of moral sort of questionability about the ways that these sort of situations or living situations like the warehouse present these sort of moral qualms, right? We have young children that are not being taken care of as they should, that are sort of at the mercy of the people around them. And then we have drug use, and we also have, older adults and these sort of teenagers that are not quite of an age in which they can consent. Or not at all at an age in which they can consent, actually. So this contextually is after Didion has discussed the warehouse. The warehouse is a sort of condemned building in which people stay, or they're sort of squatting. And we notice that she repeats Michael's name as she focuses on him. So Michael is staying there now, Michael's mother, Sue Ann. Michael was on the rocking horse. There was Michael in it, so she repeats his name, which sort of shows her highlighting, sort of putting a spotlight on Michael, this young child in this less than functional situation. We also have dialogue used, which helps us to sort of see the reality of the situation, and also to sort of put ourselves into this setting. So she's using dialogue as a way to chronicle the details of what she's witnessing. We also have these sort of journalistic observations. So the details that she presents, like the fact that the horse doesn't have a paint on it, sort of represents the sort of lack of caring, the lack of care, the lack of, in some ways, like hygiene, the way that things are sort of falling apart. And that's the circumstances in which this child is living, and in which these adults are living as well, and Sharon. We have some important details that sort of characterize these different individuals, like Sue Ann. So she's sweet, right? But she also has this sort of preoccupation with cooking and baking, while her son is off, sort of left to his own devices. We have Max, right, who has a court case, and who has a sort of shady relationship, it seems, with Sharon. We have this discussion of STP that everybody is sort of focused on, and this is something that Didion sort of weighs in on, and sort of saying that it was a big deal then, that it was relatively hard to come by, and that's part of why they're excited about it. So we have Didion's perspective in this. She's sort of telling us what she sees and what stands out to her, and what she's observing. And though she doesn't come out and say it, she doesn't comment on it specifically, we get the sense that she's seeing this situation and sort of seeing it as a sort of chaotic world, as a world in which there's a lot of disorder, sort of entropy, where people are fixated on things like drugs and not as concerned about other responsibilities that they might have, like the keeping of children. They seem sort of without direction, and that's something that we can see throughout other parts of the text as well. Or with very particular directions in terms of political critique. But there's a sort of lack of thought, a lack of thoughtfulness that she seems to be chronicling in this passage and throughout the text. Okay, so that's it for this week. So these are the texts that I'm asking you to read. So there's a couple David Sedaris texts from Me Talk Pretty One Day, and then Slashing Towards Bethlehem. I'll also be putting out a study guide for the exam, and the exam will be posted, so as soon as you finish with the things for this week, you're welcome to take that exam. And I'll be posting your grades shortly this week as well, as I'm working through finishing up the grading and so forth. If you have questions, feel free to contact me. Otherwise, I hope you have a good rest of your week.